Magnus Wave-Walker could navigate any ocean by reading currents, stars, and the whisper of wind on water. His knowledge of sea routes had made three kingdoms rich through trade, exploration, and conquest. But when he demanded fair payment for guiding their fleets to legendary treasures, they marooned him on a barren rock with nothing but seawater and spite. What they forgot was that the ocean never abandons those who truly understand its ways. Magnus Wave-Walker had spent 40 years learning to read the ocean like other men read books. He understood how underwater currents carved invisible highways through the depths, how star positions revealed location with mathematical precision, and how the color and taste of seawater told stories about distant shores and hidden dangers. His reputation had been built through decades of impossible navigation achievements that seemed to defy natural law. He had guided merchant fleets through reef systems that appeared impassable on any chart, found safe channels through ice fields that crushed other vessels, and discovered sea routes connecting distant lands that most captains believed were separated by impossible distances. But Magnus's true gift was understanding the ocean as a living entity with moods, memories, and intentions of its own. He knew how to read the subtle signs that warned of coming storms days before they appeared, how to find freshwater springs beneath salt waves, and most importantly, how to navigate by currents that flowed deeper than surface waters. This knowledge had transformed the economies of entire kingdoms. Trade routes Magnus discovered had brought exotic goods, rare metals, and strategic advantages that shifted the balance of power across the northern seas. Conquest fleets he guided had established colonies on lands previously thought mythical. Exploration expeditions under his navigation had returned with treasures that funded entire royal dynasties. His services had been sought by every maritime power, making him the most valuable navigator in the known world. Despite his irreplaceable contributions to their prosperity, Magnus had always been treated as a hired tool rather than a partner in the wealth his knowledge created. He received modest payments for guiding expeditions that returned with treasures worth kingdoms, while the merchants and nobles who employed him became fantastically wealthy from routes he had discovered. The breaking point came when the Merchant Council of Three Kingdoms, an alliance of the richest trading houses, commissioned Magnus to guide their largest fleet ever assembled toward the legendary Amber Islands, rumored to hold enough precious stones to fund armies for generations. "Your payment will be generous as always," Council Leader Erickson announced, offering a purse that contained less than 1% of the expedition's expected profits. Standard navigators' wages for standard navigators' work. Magnus's response carried the authority of someone whose expertise had reshaped entire economies. "Standard wages ended when you started using my routes to build empires. I demand partnership, 20% of whatever we find, or find another navigator for your treasure hunt." The council's reaction revealed their true feelings about the man whose knowledge had made them rich. "You forget your place, Magnus. You're a hired guide, not a partner. Accept our generous offer or find yourself unemployed." What followed was a test of wills that both sides believed they couldn't afford to lose. Magnus knew that his unique knowledge made him irreplaceable. No other navigator understood the deep currents and stellar alignments needed to reach the Amber Islands safely. The Merchant Council believed that their wealth and power made them indispensable. Magnus needed their ships, crews, and financing to practice his craft. "Choose carefully," Erickson warned during their final negotiation. "Defy us, and you'll discover how little use the most skilled navigator in the world has when nobody will hire him." Magnus's response was delivered with the calm confidence of someone who had guided kings through storms. "Then we both learn whether greed is stronger than expertise. But remember, the ocean remembers every debt, and some currents run deeper than you understand." The standoff lasted 3 days before the Merchant Council made a decision that revealed their fundamental misunderstanding of Magnus's relationship with the sea itself. If he wouldn't serve them willingly, they would ensure he could never serve their competitors either. The betrayal came during what Magnus believed was a final negotiation aboard the flagship of the assembled treasure fleet. Instead of reaching agreement, he found himself surrounded by armed sailors and accused of crimes designed to justify his permanent removal from the maritime trade. Magnus Wave-Walker, Erickson announced with false judicial authority, you stand convicted of extortion, threatening legitimate commerce, and attempting to hold hostage the economic interests of 3 kingdoms. The sentence is marooning, permanent exile on uninhabited land with no possibility of return. The rock they chose for his prison was a barren spire of stone barely 50 paces across, jutting from deep ocean more than 100 miles from the nearest inhabited shore. No vegetation grew on its wind-scoured surface, no freshwater spring provided relief from thirst, and no natural shelter offered protection from storms. As they rowed away from his prison, leaving him with nothing but the clothes on his back and contempt for his arrogance, Magnus called after them with words that carried across the water like prophecy. The sea remembers every injustice, and the ocean never forgets those who serve it faithfully. You'll discover what depths your greed has stirred. Survival on the barren rock should have been impossible, but Magnus possessed knowledge that his captors had never imagined. He understood tidal patterns well enough to predict when the lowest waters would reveal edible seaweed clinging to the rock's base, knew stellar positions that indicated when rain squalls would provide precious fresh water, and most importantly, recognized the deep current signatures that meant certain types of sea life would pass close enough to catch. But more than practical survival skills, Magnus had developed during his decades at sea a spiritual connection to the ocean that transcended ordinary navigation. He could sense the moods of the water around his prison, feel the pulse of currents that flowed far beneath the surface, and most mysteriously, communicate with the sea itself through methods that had no names in any human language. During the long months of isolation, this connection deepened beyond anything Magnus had experienced while sailing on ships built by human hands. Without the distraction of hull, sail, and crew, he could feel every current within 1,000 miles, sense every storm forming beyond the horizon, and most importantly, understand the ocean's growing anger about the injustice done to its most faithful servant. 18 months after the marooning, reports began reaching the 3 kingdoms of impossible ships appearing throughout their territorial waters. These vessels followed no design that any shipwright recognized, sailed at speeds that defied wind patterns, and most disturbing of all, seemed to be crewed by men who had died at sea under mysterious circumstances. The Phantom Fleet's raids were surgical in their precision, targeting exactly the ships and routes that Magnus had discovered for the Merchant Council. They appeared from fogs that formed in clear weather, struck with tactics that suggested intimate knowledge of every defensive position, and vanished into currents that no living navigator understood well enough to follow. But most terrifying was the realization that these attacks were not random piracy. They were systematic reclamation. The Phantom ships took only treasures that had been gathered using Magnus's routes, seized only cargo that his navigation had made possible to acquire, and left untouched any wealth that merchants had earned through their own discoveries. As their most profitable trade routes became impossible to navigate safely, the Merchant Council faced economic collapse that threatened to destroy the wealth Magnus's knowledge had built. Their fleets were being systematically eliminated by an enemy that seemed to possess supernatural understanding of oceanic warfare. Desperate attempts to hire other navigators failed because the Phantom Fleet's tactics seemed to anticipate every possible course correction or evasive maneuver. It was as if their enemy possessed perfect knowledge of how every current flowed, every wind blew, and every star moved across the northern skies. The breakthrough in understanding came when survivors of phantom fleet attacks began reporting impossible details about their encounters. The enemy crews moved with the fluid coordination of ocean currents themselves. Their ship appeared and disappeared like tides. And most chilling of all, their leader's voice carried the authority of someone who had become part of the sea itself. "Magnus," whispered the captain of the merchant vessel Sea Serpent after his crew barely escaped a phantom attack. The leader called orders in Magnus's voice, new tactical details that only Magnus had learned. But Magnus is dead. We left him on that rock 18 months ago. Ericsson's desperate expedition to Magnus's prison rock confirmed their worst fears and revealed the true scope of their error. The barren spire stood empty except for strange formations of seaweed and coral that had somehow grown in patterns resembling navigation charts, star maps, and current diagrams that no natural process could have created. But more disturbing than Magnus's absence was the presence of something that shouldn't have existed on solid rock. A tide pool that contained water deeper than the rock was tall, filled with currents that moved in directions that defied gravity and physics. Looking into those impossible waters, Ericsson saw depths that seemed to contain entire oceans, complete with creatures and landscapes that existed nowhere in the natural world. As he stared into the mysterious pool, Magnus's voice rose from waters that had no bottom, carrying the patient authority of someone who had transcended ordinary human limitations. Greed made you forget that some men don't just navigate the ocean, we become part of it. The sea accepted what you threw away, and now it offers justice that flows deeper than your understanding. The final confrontation came when Magnus materialized aboard Ericsson's flagship during the return voyage from the empty prison rock. But this was not the man they had marooned 18 months earlier. This was something that moved with the fluid grace of ocean currents, spoke with the voice of tide and storm, and commanded winds and waves like extensions of his own will. "You left me to die for demanding fair payment," Magnus said, his form shifting between solid flesh and flowing water. "But the ocean rewards those who serve it faithfully, and I have learned to navigate currents that flow through realms you never imagined existed." The demonstration that followed proved that death had not ended Magnus's career as a navigator. It had completed his education. He guided Ericsson's ship through a maze of waterspouts, phantom reefs, and impossible currents that should have destroyed any vessel, while explaining with terrifying calm how each maneuver worked according to oceanic laws that living navigators could never fully comprehend. "This is justice," Magnus announced as supernatural currents carried the merchant ship toward shores that appeared on no earthly chart. "You'll spend the rest of your lives learning what it means to be truly lost at sea, navigating waters that change according to my will rather than natural law." The Merchant Council's fate became legend throughout the maritime world as a warning about the consequences of betraying those whose expertise transcends ordinary skill. Their fleets continued to sail, but never again reached their intended destinations, forever lost in currents that followed Magnus's design rather than natural flow. But the deeper lesson was about the relationship between mastery and mystery. Magnus had spent 40 years learning to read the ocean, only to discover through betrayal and death that true navigation meant becoming part of the forces he had studied. His knowledge had evolved from understanding the sea to joining it, from reading currents to controlling them. The Phantom Fleet continued to patrol the northern waters, ensuring that maritime trade followed principles of justice and fair compensation rather than pure greed. And sometimes, In the deep of night, when fog rolled in from impossible directions, sailors claimed to hear Magnus's voice carried on winds that blew from depths no living man had ever seen, reminding them that the ocean never forgets those who serve it truly, and never forgives those who abuse its gifts. If this tale of ultimate payback moved you, hit that like button and let us know in the comments which part shocked you the most. Subscribe to Time for Payback for more legendary stories where betrayal meets justice, and don't forget to ring that notification bell, because every betrayal has its reckoning, and every story holds the power to change everything. What revenge story should we tell next? Drop your suggestions below. Until next time, remember, karma never forgets. Karma